Do you know that every African leader who dared to reject Europe's grip and instead turned to Russia or Cuba was marked for death before their dream could even take root? Not because they were corrupt, not because they failed, but because they said, "Let Africa stand on her own." These were not tyrants. They were teachers, doctors, poets, soldiers. They gave their lives for land, for dignity, for the soul of their people, and they were betrayed. Not just by the West, with its banks, bombs, and oil contracts, but by their own, by African hands bought by foreign powers. They were smeared, isolated, overthrown, and assassinated. Some with bullets, some with poison, some with lies so polished they still echo today. They did not choose chaos, they chose sovereignty. And that made them dangerous. This is not just history. It's a warning. It's a wound, and it's time we told it. In this powerful series, we uncover the untold truth of 13 African lions, revolutionaries who turned east when Europe said kneel and paid the ultimate price for believing Africa deserved better. You'll hear the stories of Lumumba, Sékou Touré, Eduardo Mondlane, Cabral, Gaddafi, and others whose names were erased, but whose spirits never died. And I must warn you, the 13th story will make you cry. Welcome to Black Stories Untold. 1. Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was not born into wealth or privilege. He was born into colonial Ghana, then the Gold Coast, a land of cocoa, gold, and stolen labor. A land where black men bowed before British governors and schools taught children to love their chains. But even as a boy, he felt something was wrong. His mind was sharp. His heart burned with questions. And the more he learned, the more he understood. Africa was not poor, it was being looted. He studied in the United States and the United Kingdom, while others learned to mimic the colonizer, and Nkrumah studied the mechanics of liberation. He read Marx, he listened to Garvey, he spoke with W.E.B. Du Bois. He didn't just want Ghana's freedom, he wanted Africa's resurrection. In 1945, at the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, he joined with other great sons of Africa to declare that colonialism must die. And when he returned home, he did not wait politely for permission. He roared. He formed the Convention People's Party and organized mass action. He was arrested, beaten, imprisoned. But the people loved him. While behind bars, they voted him into office. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. And the world watched a new era begin. Nkrumah didn't stop there. He built roads, opened schools, launched factories, created scholarships, empowered farmers, promoted science and technology. He wanted to make Ghana a model for African development. But more than that, he wanted Africa to rise together. One flag, one currency, one army, one voice. He called for a United States of Africa, not as a dream, but as a practical necessity. He believed that without unity, Africa would remain weak, divided, and vulnerable to the very powers that had once enslaved her. The West smiled politely, but behind closed doors, they began to worry. Nkrumah refused to play by their rules. He refused IMF loans with their hidden chains. He denounced neo-colonialism at the United Nations. He called out US interference. He warned of the British hand in African division. And most daring of all, he turned to the Soviet Union. He wasn't interested in ideology. He was interested in independence. The Soviets built Ghana's first atomic reactor. They helped with infrastructure. They offered education and engineering aid without trying to own the country's future. And in that moment, the CIA and MI6 decided Kwame Nkrumah had to go. In 1966, while on a peace mission in Vietnam, ironically trying to help stop a war, Nkrumah's government was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup. The men who took power claimed they were saving Ghana from dictatorship, but they were puppets, welcomed by the West with open arms and hidden smiles. Nkrumah's statues were pulled down, his books were banned, his name was erased from public school syllabuses, his vision was mocked. And where did the dreamer go? He fled to Guinea, where his friend Sékou Touré gave him asylum and named him honorary co-president. But there was no real power left, no nation to lead, only a broken man betrayed by the very people he had lifted from the dust. He wrote books, he wrote letters, he still believed, but hope dimmed. In 1972, Kwame Nkrumah died in exile, far from Accra, far from the Black Star Square, far from the dream he had ignited. He died with a heart that had carried the entire continent and a soul burdened with silence. Ghana mourned, but too late. The same people who had once danced in the streets for his fall now wept bitterly at his passing, because they realized something profound. They had traded a lion for sheep, and the empire he warned them about had returned, not in boots and guns, but in suits and contracts. Today, Ghana still speaks his name. His face now adorns murals. His quotes echo in classrooms. His books are read again, but none of that brings him back. They called him a dictator, but he was never one. He held elections, he built institutions, he tolerated dissent, until the West began funding it to collapse his government. Then he reacted, as any man would, surrounded by hyenas in sheep's clothing. They said he was too radical, but he was only early. Everything he warned Africa about, the debt trap, the puppet regimes, the Western exploitation of African resources, has come true. He wanted to build Ghana with its own hands. Now, Ghana takes loans to build her own roads. He wanted one African currency. Now, African countries struggle under currencies they don't print and interest rates they don't set. He wanted Africa to speak with one voice. Now we have 54 presidents and no unity. And yet, they called him mad. They said he dreamed too much. But maybe Africa's greatest curse is not that we dream too much, but that we betray our dreamers. Kwame Nkrumah was not perfect, but he was sincere. He was brilliant. He was unbought, and he was punished for it. Because the world does not like Africans who don't bow. It prefers leaders who smile while signing away their countries. It celebrates presidents who beg politely. But the ones who say no, the ones who say Africa must unite, the ones who look east when the West offers only chains, those men are always cast aside. They are buried not just in graves, but in silence, in edited history books, in classrooms that forget, in media that distorts. But we remember, because lions do not die in whispers, they roar in memory. Kwame Nkrumah, the dreamer in exile, may have died far from his homeland. But his voice is not dead, his dream is not dead. It lives in the heartbeat of every African youth who still dares to ask, what if we had listened? 2. Ahmed Sékou Touré. In 1958, while the drums of independence echoed faintly across the African continent, Ahmed Sékou Touré stood where few dared to stand. France, then the master puppeteer of West Africa, offered her colonies a treacherous gift, a referendum, but it was no real choice. Remain with France, they said, and enjoy prosperity under our rule, or choose independence and be cast into the wilderness alone. It was a masterful deception, wrapped in polite diplomatic language, a trap for the fearful. And many African leaders, uncertain and cautious, accepted continued subservience under the name of cooperation. But Sékou Touré? He did not bow. He rose in the assembly and said, "We prefer poverty in freedom to riches in slavery." It was more than a slogan. It was a blow to France's pride. And Guinea, alone among all French African colonies, voted no. What followed was not a peaceful divorce. It was a vindictive dismantling. France, humiliated before the world, reacted with fury. In just weeks, they withdrew overnight, but not before unleashing one of the most vindictive campaigns of sabotage in African history. French officials destroyed everything they could not carry. Light bulbs were unscrewed and smashed. Offices were stripped. Medicine was poured down drains. Even telephones were yanked from walls. Libraries were burned. Typewriters broken. Entire institutions gutted. It was a message to the rest of Africa. This is what happens when you say no to your colonial father. Guinea was left with nothing. No electricity, no administration, no currency system, no educated workforce. The skeletal remains of a stolen state. But Sékou Touré, stubborn and proud, refused to let Guinea crawl back. He turned his gaze to the east, toward Moscow, toward the red banner of the Soviet Union. Where France had left ashes, the Soviets sent architects. Where Paris had stripped shelves, the Soviets sent books, engineers, and agricultural advisors. Guinea became a hub of socialist ambition in West Africa, fueled not by European charity, but by revolutionary solidarity. Touré built, and he inspired. He nationalized land and mineral resources, ensuring that Guinea's bauxite would not fatten the bellies of foreign empires, but nourish the bones of its own children. He invested in literacy programs, improved health systems, and promoted African culture, language, and pride. French was still taught, but now it was a tool, not a chain. Indigenous languages found space in schools. African music returned to state radio. For the first time, Guinea felt African again. But the West, it never forgave him. They labeled him a radical, a communist, a danger. His name appeared in CIA reports. Western-backed propaganda painted him as paranoid and unstable. Guinea was economically isolated. Trade was sabotaged, loans denied, and always whispers of coups, of insurgents, of dissidents trained in neighboring countries. Touré lived in the eye of a storm. Betrayals grew like weeds, some real, some planted by foreign hands. The West funded opposition groups. Internal dissent was amplified by outside voices. As assassination attempts mounted, Touré's grip hardened. Suspicion replaced trust. Prisons filled with those accused of plotting with the enemy. Some guilty, many not. And so, the revolutionary began to transform. What had begun as a bright flame of African independence began to flicker under the heavy winds of sabotage and subversion. Sékou Touré, once the fearless liberator, became more solitary, more authoritarian. The iron will that had defied France now crushed opposition at home. But few asked why. Few asked what happens to a man who is surrounded by knives year after year. They called him a dictator. They said he had turned against his own people, but they never said how France had tried to break him, how Europe had exiled him in spirit, or how Western isolation had poisoned Guinea's economy. They never said that the world made him paranoid. In truth, Touré was a man exhausted by betrayal. Betrayed by France, the so-called cradle of liberty. Betrayed by fellow African leaders who feared standing beside him. Betrayed by global institutions that claimed neutrality while kneeling before Paris, London, and Washington. And yet, despite it all, he held firm. He died in 1984 while undergoing heart surgery in the United States. A cruel irony. The man who had refused the West in life was forced to depend on its machines in death. When the news reached Guinea, the country wept. Markets closed. Radios played funeral music. Women wrapped their heads in white cloth. Even those who had feared him cried, for they remembered the young man who once told the French president to take his empire and leave. But the West did not mourn. No, but they exhaled. The lion who had growled at the gates of colonialism was gone. And now they could return, disguised in aid, reform, and democracy. And they did. One by one, the vultures circled back. Sékou Touré's death marked not just the passing of a man, but the end of an era where a single African voice could shake a continent. Today, Guinea walks with scars. Its resources still tempt foreign powers, its people still battle poverty. But deep in its mountains, the echo of that voice remains. We prefer poverty and freedom to riches in slavery. It is not just a slogan, it is a wound, a warning, a prayer. Sékou Touré's story is not one of failure, it is a testimony, a reminder that freedom, real freedom, costs more than blood. It costs friendship, it costs comfort, it costs peace, and sometimes it costs your own people's understanding. But what would Africa be today had every leader followed his path? Had every nation said no with the same thunder? Perhaps the continent would not be free of hardship, but it would be free in spirit. And that is a price worth paying. 3. Patrice Emery Lumumba, the martyr of the Congo, whose voice cried for African dignity and whose death marked one of the most brutal betrayals in modern African history. A man who gave his people independence, only to be slaughtered for choosing justice over submission. He didn't die like a soldier in war. He didn't die as a traitor. He died because he told the truth and refused to kneel. Patrice Lumumba was not a warlord, not a tyrant, not a puppet. He was a postman, a teacher, a writer, a voice, a simple man with a fire inside that no jail could contain and no empire could extinguish. Born in 1925 in the Congo under brutal Belgian rule, Lumumba grew up in a land where black men were made to carry identity cards like criminals, where education for Africans ended after primary school, where white missionaries taught that to be African was to be inferior. He watched as Congo's rubber, copper, and diamonds were stripped away by foreign hands, while his people lived in mud huts, starved, and were whipped for defiance. And he said, "Enough." In a colonial world of compliance and silence, Lumumba dared to speak, not in whispers, but in thunder. He organized, he resisted, he taught his people that they were not slaves, not servants, not savages. They were a nation, they were a people. By the late 1950s, Lumumba had become the face of Congolese independence. Charismatic, eloquent, and fearless, he led the Mouvement National Congolais, MNC, and demanded not gradual reform, but full independence from Belgium. In 1960, Congo was granted independence. Lumumba became the country's first democratically elected prime minister. A dream fulfilled, or so it seemed. But at the independence ceremony, Belgium's King Baudouin gave a speech praising colonialism, calling it a civilizing mission. Belgian officials expected African leaders to smile politely, nod gratefully, and clap. But Lumumba stood, and in a moment that shook the halls of European arrogance, he replied, "No Congolese worthy of the name will ever be able to forget that independence was won in struggle, a struggle in which we were undaunted by privation or suffering and were prepared to give our lives." He didn't insult the king. He told the truth. And for that, they decided Lumumba must die. Within weeks, the nightmare began. The mineral-rich province of Katanga seceded from Congo with the backing of Belgium and foreign corporations. Lumumba's calls for unity were ignored. His army was infiltrated. The president, Joseph Kasavubu, turned against him, pressured by Western embassies. The United Nations, whom Lumumba appealed to for help, refused to intervene. So he turned to the Soviet Union. It was not ideology that drove him, it was desperation. The Soviets offered logistical support. For the West, this was an unforgivable sin. The CIA, the Belgian government, and a host of Western allies launched one of the most sinister covert operations in modern African history. Their goal? Remove Lumumba at all costs. In September 1960, Lumumba was illegally dismissed from office. He tried to flee to his allies in the east. He was captured by troops loyal to Mobutu Sese Seko, a young military officer secretly backed by the CIA. He was beaten, bound, humiliated. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was flown to Katanga, the very province that had seceded with Belgian support. There, in a dark forest clearing, he was tortured for hours by Belgian officers and Congolese traitors. Then he was shot. His body was dissolved in acid by Belgian Police Commissioner Gerard Soete, who kept Lumumba's teeth as trophies. No grave, no funeral, no justice. The West denied involvement, but declassified documents from Belgium, Britain, and the United States have since confirmed it all. The CIA had plotted multiple assassination methods, poisoned toothpaste, chemical injections, but in the end they let Belgium pull the trigger. Why? Because Lumumba was not controllable. Because he believed Congo's minerals should benefit Congolese people. Because he believed black Africans could govern themselves. Because he chose Moscow over Manhattan when the West turned its back. They couldn't bribe him. They couldn't intimidate him. So they murdered him. The Congo was thrown into decades of dictatorship under Mobutu, who sold the country's resources to Western powers while enriching himself. The people starved. The land bled. But the copper and diamonds flowed. And the world called it stability. Lumumba left behind a widow, Pauline, and small children. He left behind a nation too traumatized to mourn, too shattered to rise. And yet, he also left behind something eternal, a voice. A voice that still echoes in classrooms, in rallies, in whispered prayers across Africa. A voice that said, "We are no longer your monkeys. We are men. We are free." The Western press called him dangerous, unpredictable, immature. But what scared them was not his anger, it was his clarity. Because Lumumba saw through the lie of independence without sovereignty. He saw that flags meant nothing without land, that parliaments meant nothing without power, that Africa would never be free as long as the West controlled its gold, its oil, and its mind. And so they silenced him, not just with bullets, but with silence, with erased pages, with schools that never spoke his name, with leaders who were taught to forget. But we do not forget. In 2002, Belgium formally apologized for its moral responsibility in his murder. But it was not morality that killed Lumumba. It was greed. It was fear. It was imperial arrogance cloaked in diplomacy. Patrice Lumumba did not live to see his vision realized, but his death was not in vain. It ignited movements. It awakened a generation. It put the West on trial, not in a courtroom, but in the conscience of every African child who asks, "Why did they kill our father?" They killed him because he was Africa, standing upright, because he refused to crawl, because he believed we are enough. And in the end, perhaps that is the most revolutionary act of all. 4. Eduardo Mondlane. There are men who fight with guns, and there are men who fight with ideas. Eduardo Mondlane was both. He was not born into privilege, yet his brilliance carved pathways into the world's most powerful universities. A son of Mozambique, then shackled under the heavy heel of Portuguese colonialism, he grew up watching his people live not as citizens, but as subjects. They tilled soil they did not own. They paid taxes to a crown that never fed them. They were denied education, dignity, and the right to dream. But Mondlane dared to dream anyway. He studied in South Africa, in the United States, and later earned a degree in anthropology from Northwestern University. He could have stayed abroad. He could have taken a professorship, written books, and lived a comfortable life. But the call of the motherland was louder than comfort. It burned in his chest like fire. He knew that no amount of academic prestige could quiet the cries of a continent still in chains. And so he returned, not with applause, but with purpose. Mondlane was no blind rebel. He was a thinker, a visionary, a philosopher-warrior who believed that Africa's fight must be guided by intellect, not just emotion. He saw liberation not just as the removal of colonizers, but as the reconstruction of the African soul, a return to dignity, to collective ownership, to community-based justice. In 1962, he founded Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front. It was not just a military outfit. It was a revolutionary movement. He brought together exiled Mozambicans, peasants, intellectuals, and guerrillas into one united force to fight for freedom. He wanted more than political independence. He wanted a new society, free of tribalism, corruption, and capitalism's greed. Mondlane was inspired by socialist ideals. He believed in land for the people, education for all, and a nation ruled by workers, not elites. The West scoffed. Portugal, a fascist dictatorship under Salazar, condemned him as a terrorist. But the oppressed masses of Mozambique began to see him as something else, a light in the colonial darkness. To resist Portugal was to fight a member of Neto, a nation backed silently by the United States, Britain, and France. And so, Mondlane turned east. The Soviet Union and Cuba welcomed him with open arms. They trained Frelimo fighters. They sent weapons, doctors, and advisors. Moscow published his writings. Havana broadcast his speeches. But the West was watching. A scholar from Africa aligning with Marxism? A resistance movement gaining momentum? That was dangerous, not just to Portugal, but to the entire neo-colonial system that kept Africa chained through loans, aid, and soft power manipulation. And so, they came for him. On February 3rd, 1969, a brown parcel arrived at Mondlane's office in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. It looked like an ordinary package. Perhaps another letter from a comrade, perhaps a book, perhaps a report. He opened it, and in one blinding moment, his body was torn apart by explosives hidden inside. There was no trial, no confrontation, no battlefield. They didn't face him with argument. They didn't face him with courage. They faced him with cowardice and bombs. Portuguese secret police, PIDE, later admitted involvement. But they were not alone. Evidence has long pointed to collusion with NATO-linked agencies, working quietly behind Portugal, providing intelligence and clearance for the hit. Because Mondlane wasn't just dangerous to Lisbon, he was dangerous to every European power that feared the rise of a united Marxist Africa. He died in pieces, a man of peace, a man of books and strategy, a man who had chosen ideas over violence, but was answered with violence anyway. The movement cried out in pain. His comrades gathered his remains with trembling hands. His wife, Janet Mondlane, a white American woman who had stood beside him through every step of the revolution, buried the love of her life under the red flag of a struggle not yet won. Frelimo was shaken, but it did not collapse. Because Eduardo Mondlane had not built a cult of personality. He had built an institution, a movement that could survive his death. And from the ashes of his assassination rose another lion, Samora Machel, who took up the mantle and led Frelimo to final victory in 1975, liberating Mozambique after years of bloodshed. But something was lost that day in 1969. A gentler path, a vision shaped by reason and hope. A Mozambique that might have risen not from war, but from the quiet strength of ideas. They didn't just kill a man, they killed a future. Eduardo Mondlane wanted a nation built on justice. He wanted socialism without paranoia, liberation without terror. His dream was precise, clean, bright. Instead, Mozambique endured a brutal guerrilla war. Thousands died. Villages burned. Foreign interests continued to meddle, first through Portugal, then through proxy wars, then through economic sabotage. Mondlane had warned of this. He had written of the dangers of external manipulation, of Africa being turned into a chessboard for Western and Eastern powers. He believed Africa needed allies, but not masters. Partnership, not dependency. And that made him even more dangerous, because he wasn't just a fighter. He was a man who understood the system and wanted to burn it down. They couldn't co-opt him, so they silenced him. But even today, his name breathes through the halls of African revolution. Schools bear his name, statues stand in his honor. His writings, once censored, are now studied. And his widow, Janet, continued his work for decades, educating, building, reminding the world that Mozambique's freedom had a price. A bloody, cowardly price. Eduardo Mondlane's story is a testament that the West does not always fear armies. Sometimes it fears pens. It fears ideas wrapped in brown paper. It fears African minds that refuse to beg. Because men like Mondlane do not need armies to start revolutions. They only need truth. And that is what makes them lethal. 5. Mengistu Haile Mariam. Sometimes history remembers the gun and forgets the hand that held it. It remembers the blood and forgets the broken promise behind it. Mengistu Haile Mariam was one of Africa's most complex revolutionaries, a man who clawed his way from the dust of poverty into the very seat of empire. He broke crowns, he burned titles, he tried to rebuild a nation on the ashes of monarchy and feudalism. And for this, they called him a monster. But Mengistu did not come from palaces. He was the son of a soldier, humble, dark-skinned and poor in a society where royalty reigned and bloodlines mattered more than merit. Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, was a land of glittering robes and grinding hunger. The aristocracy lived in marble, while the farmers toiled barefoot. Feudal lords held entire villages in bondage. Land ownership was a dream denied to the masses. Ethiopia was independent on paper, but enslaved from within. Mengistu entered the military not for glory, but to survive. It was there, among the soldiers, that he began to see a different vision for Ethiopia, one where the land belonged to those who tilled it, where education was not a privilege of princes, and where power came from the people, not divine right. Then came the droughts, the famines, the rumors of corruption, and in 1974, the House of the Lion of Judah fell. Emperor Haile Selassie, a man once hailed as a god in the eyes of Rastafarians, was overthrown by a committee of young military officers, the Derg. And at the center of this rising storm was Mengistu. But while others hesitated, Mengistu roared. He rose above the factional chaos and seized leadership. In a speech that would make history, he flung red blood-filled bottles onto the ground during a televised address, declaring the end of monarchy, feudalism, and Western imperialism in Ethiopia. The world watched in horror. Ethiopia had not just changed regimes, it had entered a revolution. Mengistu declared Ethiopia a Marxist-Leninist state. He nationalized land, redistributed wealth, and abolished the aristocracy. He launched massive literacy campaigns, expanded healthcare, and tried to industrialize a country that had been chained to a pre-modern economy. He opened Ethiopia's doors, not to London or Washington, but to Moscow and Havana. And Russia answered. The Soviet Union, locked in a Cold War with the West, saw in Mengistu a powerful African ally. Tanks, jets, advisors, economic assistance, all poured into Addis Ababa. Cuba sent 17,000 troops to help Mengistu repel Somalia's US-backed invasion during the Ogaden War. It was one of the most significant shows of anti-Western solidarity in Cold War Africa. Against the odds, Ethiopia held its ground. But the victories came with enemies. The West recoiled. The United States, which had once armed Haile Selassie, now saw Ethiopia as a threat. A Soviet outpost on the Horn of Africa. Unacceptable. Sanctions followed. Aid was withheld. The Western press painted Mengistu not as a revolutionary, but as a butcher. Then came the famine of the 1980s. Crops failed, drought returned, and the media swarmed. Images of starving Ethiopian children with sunken eyes and bloated bellies flashed across global screens. But what the world didn't see was the context. That the US had cut off food assistance, that the infrastructure to distribute aid was shattered by conflict, and that internal rebellion was being funded and supported by foreign agencies who wanted Mengistu gone. They never showed the CIA-backed operatives crossing Ethiopia's borders. They never showed the arms shipments to rebel groups. They never showed the diplomatic isolation imposed on a leader who dared to turn his back on Western control. They only showed the bodies. And Mengistu grew colder. Paranoia set in. He launched internal purges against those suspected of treason. Executions rose. Thousands were imprisoned. Secret trials, informants, disappearances. The man who once spoke of people's power now ruled through fear. But who created that fear? Was it born in his heart or planted there by the constant whispers of coup, sabotage, and betrayal? He was called tyrant, despot, dictator. But in rural Ethiopia, landless peasants who had lived for centuries under lords were finally given their own farms. Health clinics were built in places where no doctor had ever walked. Girls learned to read for the first time. Was that tyranny too? History does not remember those victories. In 1991, the hammer finally fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Moscow went silent. The tanks stopped rolling in. The aid dried up. Cuba withdrew. Mengistu was alone, and the West pounced. Rebel forces, long armed and trained in secret by foreign allies, swept into Addis Ababa. The revolution was over. Mengistu fled to Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe, another man hated for his defiance, gave him refuge. He has lived there ever since, in exile, his name spoken with both reverence and revulsion. In Western books, he is remembered only as a villain, a man of famine and fear. But the truth is not so simple. Mengistu was a man forged in fire, thrown into a battle between empires. He tried to make Ethiopia stand tall in a world that wanted it on its knees. He tried to modernize a feudal society without the help of the West. He tried to speak loudly in a world where Africa is told to whisper, and for that he was broken. He is remembered as both liberator and tyrant, because history, like he once said, is written by those with cameras, not scars. The famine was shown on television, but the blockade was not. The executions were counted, but the sabotage was not. The cruelty was aired. The context was buried. Even iron, if struck long enough, begins to melt. Mengistu Haile Mariam stood like a wall against the tide of imperialism. But when the Cold War ended and the East fell silent, there was no one left to shield him from the storm. Was he perfect? No. But was he evil? Or was he simply a man trying to lead a wounded nation through a firestorm and burned his own soul in the process? Today, his name is spoken with caution in Ethiopia. Some curse him, others defend him, but no one forgets him. because Mengistu was not just a ruler, he was a war cry. 6. Amílcar Cabral. In the history of Africa's long and bloody struggle against colonialism, there are warriors who took up guns, and then there are those who picked up pens, ideas, and truth. Amílcar Cabral was both. A quiet storm, a man of fierce intellect and radical tenderness, a revolutionary who spoke softly but carried the weight of a continent in his heart. He did not fight for power, he fought for meaning. Born in 1924 in Cape Verde, a dry archipelago under Portuguese rule, Cabral was the son of two teachers, humble, firm, and rooted in African pride. He grew up surrounded by the scent of salt water and the wounds of colonialism. But from a young age, he knew that education was more than just literacy. It was liberation. He studied agronomy in Lisbon, where he experienced the cold sharpness of European racism firsthand. He saw how Africa was studied like a specimen, not respected like a civilization. He saw how African students were expected to admire Portugal, not question it. But Cabral questioned everything. He returned to Guinea-Bissau not just with a degree in agriculture, but with a blueprint for freedom. He traveled from village to village, mapping not just the soil, but the soul of his people. He spoke with elders, fishermen, farmers. He listened more than he spoke. He believed that a revolutionary must love the people, not rule them. In 1956, he founded the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. But unlike many movements, it was not fueled by anger alone. It was fueled by vision. Cabral taught his fighters to respect civilians, never steal from them and never abuse them. He told them that the greatest weapon in their hands was not the gun, but the idea. He once said, "Claim no easy victories." And he lived by those words. Portugal was a colonial power backed by Neto and armed by the West. The regime of Salazar was brutal, fascist, and determined to keep its African colonies by any means. When peaceful petitions were ignored, Cabral turned to armed struggle, but even then he remained different. He trained his fighters in discipline, humility, and education. He insisted they learn to read, to plant crops, to care for their communities. The revolution, he said, was not just about expelling the Portuguese, it was about rebuilding the African personality. Cabral's ideas attracted attention far beyond Guinea. He became a sought-after speaker in the halls of the United Nations. His speeches moved people not just with fire, but with grace. He spoke of culture as a tool of resistance. He argued that colonialism did not only conquer land, it conquered the mind. And that is why the West feared him. Not because he commanded armies, but because he commanded thought. Cabral built strong relationships with Cuba, China, and the Soviet Union. These alliances brought weapons, training, and ideological support. But Cabral never allowed himself to be used as a puppet. He believed in African independence, not ideological dependency. Even while working with communists, he warned of the dangers of repeating foreign mistakes. He was respected precisely because he did not follow blindly. But for the West, his independence was unacceptable. For Portugal, he was a threat that could not be tolerated, because Cabral's revolution was winning. By the early 1970s, over two-thirds of Guinea-Bissau was under PAIGC control. Portuguese soldiers were demoralized, the colonial government was collapsing. And worse, for the empire, Cabral's success was inspiring other African liberation movements. He was becoming a Pan-African symbol, a dangerous example that Africans could liberate themselves without Western oversight. So they came for him, but not on the battlefield, not with armies, with betrayal. On January 20th, 1973, just months before Guinea-Bissau was set to declare independence, Amílcar Cabral was assassinated outside his home in Conakry, Guinea. The killers? Members of his own party, PAIGC insiders, bought, bribed or manipulated by Portuguese intelligence, PIDE, a bullet to the chest. A revolutionary collapsed not in war, but in the cold silence of treachery. He didn't die as a soldier, he died as a seed, planted in blood. The world reacted with shock, but the machinery of empire was quiet. No Western government condemned his killing. No NATO country launched an investigation, because to them his silence was convenient. He was too smart, too loved, too dangerous. His comrades buried him with tears and raised the flag of Guinea-Bissau weeks later, declaring independence in his honor. But the loss was incalculable. The revolution survived, but its heart was gone. The world lost a man who might have led Africa differently. A man who could have healed the wounds with wisdom rather than power. A man who never once preached hate, but was murdered like a villain. The West never speaks of him. His name is absent in their history books, because they do not like African heroes who cannot be corrupted. And make no mistake, they didn't just kill a man, they killed an idea that Africa could rise through dignity, that a black man could speak at the UN without asking permission, that a guerrilla leader could also be a poet, that a revolutionary could also be gentle. Today, Amílcar Cabral's words live on in quiet resistance, in the classrooms of radicals, in the notebooks of thinkers, in the hearts of dreamers who believe Africa still deserves more than borders, debts and handshakes. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. He said it then, and we must say it now. Amílcar Cabral did not live to see the Africa he dreamed of, but he died trying to build it, and that makes him immortal. 7. Robert Mugabe. In the beginning he was a teacher, a quiet man with sharp eyes and an iron tongue, a man who believed in books more than bullets, until the world forced him to believe in both. Robert Mugabe was born in 1924 in what was then Southern Rhodesia, a British colony governed not by its native population, but by white settlers who hoarded land, ruled by apartheid-like laws, and stripped Africans of voice, dignity, and opportunity. A small black elite was allowed to read. The rest were meant to serve. But Mugabe learned. He studied literature, politics, history. He read Karl Marx. He studied Gandhi. And yet, what made him dangerous was not that he was radical. It was that he was clear-headed. He understood that white rule could not be reformed. It had to be overthrown. And so he turned his back on the classroom and entered the battlefield of revolution. In the 1960s, Mugabe helped form the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, one of the two main liberation movements resisting Ian Smith's white minority government. While the West supported dialogue and diplomacy, Smith entrenched white supremacy with brutal force. When Mugabe called for majority rule, he was jailed for 11 years, kept in solitary confinement, reading and writing, becoming sharper with every passing year. But jail could not contain the fire. Upon his release in 1974, he fled to Mozambique and joined ZANLA, the military wing of the resistance. From the bush, Mugabe directed a full-scale guerrilla war, one of Africa's bloodiest fights for freedom. The West watched in fear. Britain offered negotiations, but Mugabe wanted something they would not give: land, because land was the root. The white minority owned over 70% of the fertile soil, land stolen through conquest and protected by colonial courts. Mugabe knew that without land reform, independence would be a flag without soil. In 1980, after years of war, the Lancaster House Agreement was signed. Zimbabwe was born, and Mugabe was elected prime minister in a landslide. Crowds wept, children danced. Africa celebrated. celebrated, and the West pretended to smile. Mugabe was hailed as a hero in London, Paris, and Washington. He spoke calmly, diplomatically. He promised reconciliation with the white minority. He invited settlers to stay. He appointed whites to government posts. He even called them Zimbabweans. But underneath the calm, the fire still burned. For 10 years, Mugabe honored the land clause in the Lancaster Agreement. No forced seizure of white land. Britain promised to fund land reform, to pay white farmers for voluntary relocation. But by the late 1990s, those promises were broken. Tony Blair's government stopped payments, citing corruption. The West turned its back, and Mugabe turned to his people and to the land. He launched fast-track land reform. White-owned farms were seized, redistributed to black Zimbabweans, many of them war veterans. Some cheered, others wept. The economy shook. The West responded like a beast awakened. Sanctions were imposed. Zimbabwe was cut off from international credit. The IMF pulled out. The media declared Mugabe a dictator. Western ambassadors disappeared. Aid was frozen. And the economy, already fragile, began to collapse. But what hurt more than the inflation, more than the hunger, more than the lines for fuel and food, was the story being told. Because suddenly, Mugabe was no longer the hero of African independence. He was the madman, the tyrant, the man who ruined Zimbabwe. They never mentioned the land. They never mentioned the sanctions. They never mentioned the war they never forgave him for winning. In truth, the West never hated Mugabe for corruption. They hated him for taking the land back, because he did what no other African leader dared to do. He did not beg for reform. He did not sell his country to the World Bank. He did not apologize for wanting to own his own soil, and for that, they crucified him. Internally, his rule began to harden. The political opposition, MDC, grew strong. Protests erupted. Elections were marred by violence. Fear replaced faith. And Mugabe, like many revolutionaries, fell into the same trap of power he once vowed to destroy. But no one asked why the house was burning. They only blamed the man holding the match, not the decades of gasoline poured by Britain and the West. By the 2010s, Mugabe was old. His once sharp speeches became rambling. His inner circle fractured. The economy bled. His own party turned on him in 2017. Tanks rolled into Harare, not from enemies, but from within. The soldier president was unseated not by the West, but by his own generals. He died 2 years later, in exile, estranged even from the country he had named. And the silence that followed was deafening. They buried him not with reverence, but with confusion. Some called him a villain, some called him a hero, but all called him unforgettable. Because Robert Mugabe was not just a man, he was a symbol of the cost of land, of the weight of liberation, of the unbearable loneliness that comes when you defy the empire. He made mistakes, many, but he also did what most African leaders did not. He fought for freedom, won it, and dared to take the second step, economic liberation. And that is when the knives came. The West didn't kill him with bombs. They killed him with isolation, propaganda, and sanctions. They killed him with silence when he asked for reparations and noise when he fought back. They say history is written by the victors, but in Zimbabwe, history was buried with the man who tried to write his own. Robert Mugabe will remain a contradiction. To some, a tyrant who clung too long to power. To others, a lion who refused to kneel. But one thing is certain. He taught Africa the price of land is not paid in cash, but in blood, betrayal, and exile. 8. Agostinho Neto. He was not just a man of war, he was a man of words. Agostinho Neto was a physician, a poet, and a freedom fighter, a rare kind of revolutionary whose heart bled for both his people and the pages on which he wrote. In his verse, he whispered hope. In his speeches, he thundered justice. In his eyes, you saw the burden of generations crushed under colonial boots. And in his soul, there was a fire, steady, quiet, but unyielding. He did not pick up a weapon because he loved violence. He picked it up because Portugal left him no other choice. Born in 1922 in Angola, a colony ruled brutally by Portugal's fascist Estado Novo regime, Neto witnessed firsthand how the African was treated. Not as human, but as labor. Angola was a plantation, a diamond mine, a pawn. Education was limited, culture was erased. Resistance was met with prison, torture, and death. But Neto believed freedom was not just a right, it was a necessity. He studied medicine in Portugal and became politically active while in exile, helping form the MPLA, the popular movement for the liberation of Angola. But his activism came at a price. He was arrested multiple times by the Portuguese secret police, PIDE, for speaking out, for writing poems, for demanding that Angola belong to Angolans. He was tortured, exiled, silenced, but never broken. When the winds of African liberation began to blow in the 1960s, Neto stood ready. He led the MPLA from the shadows into the battlefield. His followers included workers, intellectuals, peasants, and soldiers. He spoke of a new Angola, free, socialist, African. And the West? They didn't listen. Portugal, backed quietly by NATO powers, especially the United States and Britain, held on tightly to Angola's oil, diamonds, and strategic ports. But by 1974, the fascist regime in Lisbon collapsed. The empire fractured. Portugal offered to retreat, but chaos came in its place. The Cold War had found its next battlefield. Three factions rose in Angola: MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, FNLA, backed by Zaire and the CIA, and UNITA, armed by South Africa and US interests. But Neto was different. He wasn't just fighting for territory, he was fighting for an idea. He wanted to build a nation where black Angolans owned their land, their labor, their future. His vision was socialist, Pan-African, deeply rooted in the liberation philosophies of Cabral and Nkrumah. His speeches echoed across battlefields and classrooms. He called colonialism a sickness and socialism the medicine. He called apartheid a cancer and African unity the cure. When Angola declared independence in 1975, Neto became its first president. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like the dawn of something pure. Flags were raised, children danced, the Portuguese were gone. But freedom was not free. Almost immediately, Angola was thrown into a proxy war, a war not of its making, but a war of superpowers. The CIA and apartheid South Africa funneled weapons, mercenaries and money to UNITA and FNLA. They sought to destroy Neto's Marxist government before it could take root. And so, Cuba stepped in. Over 36,000 Cuban soldiers landed on Angolan soil, not to colonize, but to defend. The USSR sent tanks, engineers, and aid. It was the first time in modern African history that black and brown allies from across the ocean came to fight beside Africans not for conquest, but for freedom. But the West painted it differently. They said Neto was a Soviet puppet. They called his government authoritarian. They spoke of Marxism like a plague, but never of the bombs they funded. The media did not show South African raids killing Angolan villagers. They did not show CIA agents setting up supply lines for rebels. They did not show how oil companies lobbied for a pro-Western regime, not a free Angola. They only showed war and blamed Neto. But still, he governed. He began building schools, hospitals, roads. He promoted women's rights, literacy, and healthcare. He nationalized industries and aimed to bring Angola's vast wealth back into the hands of her people. But the weight was too much. Constant war, foreign interference, sabotage, internal betrayal. It took a toll, not just on Angola, but on Neto himself. In 1979, at the young age of 56, Agostinho Neto died suddenly in Moscow during cancer treatment. The official cause was illness. But among the MPLA, among the revolutionaries, there were whispers that stress, betrayal, even poisoning had hastened his death. That he had been targeted not just by bullets, but by slow, silent assassination. He died far from home. A doctor whose homeland still bled. A poet whose voice was silenced before his final verse could be written. The war did not end with Neto. It continued for decades, turning Angola into a graveyard of foreign ambition. Over 500,000 Angolans died, not for ideology, but because Western and Eastern powers refused to let Africa choose her own path. Neto was not perfect. His government made mistakes. There was repression, paranoia, control. But what history forgets is that those mistakes were born in war, not in freedom. He ruled not in peace, but under siege. He was not given the luxury to dream fully. And yet, in the little time he had, he lit a candle in the darkness. Today, Agostinho Neto is remembered in Angola not just as a president, but as a father, a poet warrior who believed that the African spirit could not be colonized forever. His writings still speak truth. His voice still echoes. The most important thing is to solve the problems of the people. He said that not as a slogan, but as a principle. And that's why they tried to destroy him. Because Neto, like Cabral, like Sankara, like Lumumba, represented something more dangerous than armed rebellion. He represented a future where Africa belonged to Africans. And for that, the world conspired. The CIA gave guns to warlords. South Africa dropped bombs. Europe closed its eyes while counting diamonds. And Angola was torn open like a wound that never healed. But even in the pain, Neto's dream lives. Not in palaces or parliaments, but in every young African who still dares to ask, what if we had been left alone? What if Neto had lived? And maybe, just maybe, the soil of Angola would have bloomed, not with blood, but with the fruit of a revolution fulfilled. 9. Samora Machel. He walked like a soldier, but spoke like a healer. Samora Machel was not the kind of leader Western powers feared because of his weapons. He was feared because of his clarity, because he said things out loud that the world tried to keep quiet, because he made revolution sound like music, because he believed in a future where Africa stood on its own, unashamed, unbought, and undivided. He was a nurse by training, but a liberator by calling. Born in 1933 in the heart of Portuguese-controlled Mozambique, Machel was raised under the choking weight of colonialism. He saw how his people were forced to farm for settlers on land that was theirs only in memory. How black children were beaten for speaking their native tongue. How hospitals refused to treat the wounded of the poor. And how the world watched silently while white regimes ruled black lives like plantations in God's name. So he did what so many great African minds had to do. He stopped waiting for permission. He joined Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front, in the early 1960s. And when Eduardo Mondlane, the movement's first leader, was assassinated by a parcel bomb in 1969, Machel rose. He wasn't the most senior, he wasn't the most educated, but he was the most trusted, the most fearless, and the most committed to the soul of the revolution. Under Machel's leadership, Frelimo transformed from a fragmented resistance group into a disciplined liberation army. He trained teachers alongside soldiers. He set up mobile clinics in the bush. He taught fighters that winning meant more than conquering. It meant serving. He once told his men, "The revolution is not a bed of roses. It is a struggle between the future and the past. And in Mozambique, that struggle was brutal. Portugal, backed by Neto and the Western Bloc, threw everything at Frelimo. Helicopters, napalm, secret police, torture chambers. But Machel's guerrillas fought on. From the forests of Tate to the valleys of Niassa, the revolution moved like smoke, unpredictable, unbreakable, and fed by the breath of the people. And then, history blinked. In 1974, the fascist regime in Portugal collapsed. The revolution in Lisbon brought down the colonial government, and suddenly, after centuries of slavery, Mozambique stood on the threshold of independence. On June 25, 1975, Samora Machel stood before the world and declared, "From now on, no one will exploit our land, no one will exploit our people." He became the first president of an independent Mozambique, and immediately the vultures circled. Machel did not flirt with neocolonialism. He did not sell his soul to the IMF. He did not beg for Western aid. He declared Mozambique a Marxist-Leninist state and turned eastward. The Soviet Union became a key partner. Cuba sent teachers, doctors, and troops. Mozambique became one of the brightest flames in Africa's socialist awakening. But the West never forgets those who reject its grip. South Africa's apartheid regime, seeing Machel as a threat, launched military incursions. Rhodesian forces, now Zimbabwe, sent sabotage teams. The CIA, operating through proxies, funneled weapons to rebel groups like Renamo. Terrorists trained to burn schools, rape women, and destroy hospitals. Machel called them what they were: hired killers, tools of the West, sent to drag Africa back into chains. He wasn't wrong. For over a decade, Mozambique was bled from within by a foreign-backed civil war, designed not to conquer, but to exhaust. And yet, Machel still built. He nationalized plantations. He redistributed land. He opened literacy centers. He promoted women's rights. He trained a new generation of doctors, engineers, and thinkers. He taught Africa that socialism was not about theory. It was about making sure the child of a farmer had the same future as the child of a general. But the pressure mounted. The economy suffered. Infrastructure crumbled under the weight of war. Drought came. Famine followed. And all the while, the world pointed its finger, not at the saboteurs, but at the man trying to keep the roof from collapsing. Machel became increasingly isolated. The Soviet bloc was weakening. Cuba could no longer give as much. And in 1986, Machel was invited to attend a summit in Zambia, an opportunity to stabilize regional tensions. He went. He never came back. On October 19, 1986, Machel's presidential plane, flying at night back into Mozambique, suddenly veered off course near the Lebombo Mountains, close to the border of apartheid South Africa. It crashed. There were no distress calls, no warning. Machel was found dead in the wreckage, his body twisted, his dreams shattered. The official story said it was pilot error, that a navigational mistake caused the plane to crash. But Africa knows better. Investigations revealed the presence of a false radio beacon, a decoy set up to lure the plane off its path. Evidence pointed to the South African military, acting with intelligence support and political silence from the West. No one was punished. No one was held accountable. A lion had fallen, and the hunters danced in the shadows. Machel's death broke something in Mozambique. It broke the momentum. It broke the morale. The war dragged on for years. Foreign investors returned, but only after the dream was buried. They called him radical. They called him dangerous. They never called him right. But he was. Samora Machel knew that Africa could not be free without owning its wealth, its land, its future. He knew that true independence would not come through speeches, but through courage, through sacrifice, through refusing to kneel. And for that, they killed him. But his voice, his fire, lives. in the hills of Gaza province, where his people still sing his name, in the speeches of every African leader who dares to defy empire, in the memory of a man who once said, "There is no compromise in the struggle for liberation. Either you are with the people, or you are against them." Samora Machel was with the people, until the very end. 10. Thomas Sankara, the young, brilliant, fearless leader of Burkina Faso, whose name still burns like fire in the hearts of Africa's youth. He was a man who demanded dignity, lived with simplicity, and paid for his vision with his life. Some men rule for power, some rule for wealth, but Thomas Sankara ruled for principle, and that is why they killed him. He didn't wear gold chains or silk robes, he didn't ride in motorcades or drink from crystal. He wore his army fatigues with pride, rode a bicycle to work, slept in a modest home, ate what the people ate. He wasn't interested in being a president. He wanted to be a servant of the revolution. He was born in 1949 in Upper Volta, a land that had been humiliated, renamed, and carved by French colonialism. A place where foreign companies owned the mines, where peasants broke their backs for pennies, and where independence was only a flag, not a reality. He saw the hypocrisy early. The European missionaries who preached humility while extracting wealth. The African leaders who wore European suits while selling their countries to the West. And he said, no more. In 1983, at just 33 years old, Sankara seized power in a popular coup, backed by students, workers, and soldiers tired of puppets. The first thing he did was change the country's name from Upper Volta, a colonial relic, to Burkina Faso, meaning the land of upright people. That alone was revolutionary. He didn't just want to change the economy, he wanted to change the African soul. He looked into the eyes of the world and said, "We must decolonize our minds." And then he went to work. He launched mass vaccination campaigns, immunizing over 2.5 million children against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever in record time, without Western help. He redistributed land from the feudal landlords to the peasants. Food production soared. In just a few years, Burkina Faso became self-sufficient in grain, a feat that eluded many post-colonial nations. He promoted women's liberation, outlawing forced marriages, encouraging girls' education, and placing women in positions of power. He slashed the salaries of government officials, including his own. He sold the government's luxury fleet of Mercedes-Benz cars and replaced them with Renault 5s, the cheapest car available in Burkina Faso at the time. He banned colonial perks, no first-class flights for ministers, no lavish allowances, no imported food at state functions. He told African nations to stop relying on foreign aid, saying, "He who feeds you controls you." And the West listened. But not with admiration, with alarm. Because Sankara was dangerous, not because of his army, but because of his example. Because he was showing Africa what was possible without the IMF, without France, without World Bank structural adjustments, without bowing to Europe's economic orders. He challenged the debt trap, calling it a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa. At an OAU summit, he stood before presidents and said, "Debt is not our responsibility. If we do not pay, our creditors will not die. But if we do pay, we will." The room fell silent. Because while other African leaders shook hands with the West in daylight and begged behind closed doors, Sankara spoke what many feared to even whisper. And so, he was marked. They could not buy him. They could not intimidate him, so they decided to eliminate him. France, whose former colonial grip still shaped Francophone Africa through the CFA franc, saw in Sankara a threat to its economic dominance. The CIA, already watching West Africa closely, feared his growing popularity. But the betrayal came from within. Blé Compaoré, Sankara's longtime friend, trusted comrade, and fellow revolutionary, was seduced by the promise of power and foreign support. On October 15, 1987, during a meeting at the presidential palace, Thomas Sankara was ambushed and assassinated. He was shot 12 times, his body riddled with bullets, his face mutilated beyond recognition. No state funeral, no national mourning. Just a quick burial in an unmarked grave. The revolution was buried with him, and Compaoré took power the very next day, welcomed quietly by France and the West. The new regime reversed Sankara's policies. Foreign aid resumed, Western companies returned. Burkina Faso was open for business again. And for 27 years, Compaoré ruled, rich, protected, and celebrated in Paris. But Sankara never left. Though dead, his voice continued to echo. In university halls, in protest chants, in murals painted on village walls, in rap songs, in whispered conversations between young Africans who wondered, what if he had lived? Today, Thomas Sankara is revered as one of Africa's purest revolutionaries. A man who never took a bribe, never ruled with greed, and never apologized for believing that Africa could be enough for itself. He didn't wear a crown. He wore integrity. He didn't demand statues. He built schools. He didn't need foreign approval. He needed his people's love. And he had it. That is why the West feared him, because he wasn't just changing Burkina Faso, he was changing the terms of African dignity. And so they silenced him, not with evidence, not with debate, not with politics, but with bullets and betrayal. And yet, he remains. In Ouagadougou, his statue now stands tall, a rifle slung across his back, his eyes looking forward, unbowed, eternal. Because the West can kill a man, but it cannot kill an idea whose time has come. Thomas Sankara was not just a president, he was Africa's mirror, and many could not bear to look. 11. Didier Ratsiraka, the Red Admiral of Madagascar, a man who tried to navigate his island nation towards self-reliance and socialism, only to watch it slowly dismantled by waves of Western intervention and betrayal. He was not supposed to be a revolutionary. He wore the uniform of a naval officer, not the fatigues of a guerrilla. He came not from the jungle, but from the academy. A soft-spoken man with a precise mind, Didier Ratsiraka was trained in France, the very empire that had ruled Madagascar with colonial arrogance for decades. But beneath the medals and marine discipline beat the heart of a man who had seen too much. He had seen a nation of proud people left in poverty while their resources were shipped abroad. He had seen how independence had become a slogan, not a reality. And when he looked into the eyes of the poor, the farmers, the workers, he knew the island needed more than freedom. It needed direction. And so, when the moment came in 1975, Ratsiraka did not hesitate. He took power and declared a new path. He became Madagascar's president, and more than that, he became the architect of an African island socialist experiment. He called his vision the Second Republic, and he unveiled a revolutionary charter that echoed the words of Nkrumah, Sankara, and Cabral. He nationalized banks, mines, and industries. He built a state-driven economy. He spoke of dignity, of equality, of breaking the chains of neo-colonialism, not just through politics, but through economic independence. Ratsiraka aligned Madagascar with the Soviet Union, not out of dogma, but because he knew that the West came with loans and lectures, while the East offered steel, factories, teachers, and engineers. Soviet and North Korean advisors arrived. Cuban doctors helped in rural clinics. A new educational curriculum was developed, rooted in Malagasy identity, not French mimicry. To the West, this was a threat. A socialist stronghold in the Indian Ocean? A red star shining near their precious shipping lanes? That could not be tolerated. So the sabotage began, not with bombs, but with economic isolation. Western aid dried up, investments vanished. The IMF and World Bank began circling like sharks, whispering the magic words: reform, privatization, liberalization. But Ratsiraka held his ground. For over a decade, he governed a country that struggled, yes, but with its head held high. He built schools, expanded literacy, improved healthcare access. His government subsidized rice, transport, and education. He promoted regional diplomacy, opposing apartheid and supporting African liberation movements across the continent. He was nicknamed the Red Admiral, and for a while his ship held course. But then came 1991. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The tide turned, and the very allies who had helped build Madagascar's self-reliance vanished overnight. Ratsiraka was left stranded. The IMF returned, but not as a friend. This time they came with a knife cloaked in a handshake. They demanded the sale of state industries. They demanded the end of subsidies. They demanded currency devaluation, foreign investment deregulation, and free elections. Ratsiraka's revolutionary economy, already weakened by years of global isolation, began to crack. Under pressure, he agreed to multi-party reforms. And in 1993, he lost power. The West celebrated. The press spoke of democracy returning to Madagascar, but they said nothing of the hunger that followed. With subsidies removed, prices soared. Foreign corporations swooped in to buy what was once public. The rice that once fed families became unaffordable. Unemployment rose. Social programs collapsed. The market was free, but the people were trapped. The very revolution that Ratsiraka had built, brick by brick, was dismantled with a pen. But Ratsiraka did not disappear. In 1997, he returned to power through the ballot box. The people remembered him. They remembered cheap food, accessible education, and national pride. He tried to revive what was lost. He tried to restore state control. He tried to renegotiate with the IMF. But it was too late. The New World Order had no room for leaders who spoke of independence. The global market now ruled the village. The price of resistance was now too high and too invisible. In 2002, amid a disputed election and mass protests, Ratsiraka was removed once again. This time, he went into exile. The man who once walked tall in international summits as the symbol of Malagasy socialism now watched from a distance as his country descended into economic dependency and political chaos. He returned briefly, lived quietly, died in 2021, largely forgotten by the world that once watched him with suspicion and fear. No monuments were erected. No headlines blazed his legacy. No Western dignitaries came to lay flowers. Because Ratsiraka's story was not convenient, he did not leave behind luxury villas or Swiss bank accounts. He left behind a blueprint, a memory of what it looked like when an African leader tried to steer his country away from both empire and dependency. And for that, he was erased. They did not assassinate him with bullets. They assassinated his dream with spreadsheets, debts, and conditionalities. They didn't burn his books. They just rewrote the syllabus. And yet his memory lingers in the minds of elders who remember cheap medicine and village schools, in the quiet villages that once believed in their own strength, in the youth who ask why their country is rich in minerals but poor in everything else. Ratsiraka's lesson is clear. Even islands, remote, beautiful, seemingly untouched, are not safe from empire. Even the sea cannot protect you from neo-colonial waves. And the saddest part? He didn't fall from war. He didn't fall from scandal. He fell because the world changed its rules and no longer had space for revolution. But Madagascar remembers, and Africa must remember too. Because the Red Admiral did not drown. He was sunk by a storm he did not create. And now his lighthouse stands not on the coast, but in our memory, a warning that freedom is never given and dignity is never convenient. 12. Nelson Mandela, the revolutionary who began as a militant dissident and was later repackaged as a global icon. This narrative does not shy away from the truth, how the West once labeled him a terrorist and only embraced him after he gave up the economic liberation that so many African revolutionaries died for. He is remembered as the smiling old man, the peacemaker, the reconciler, the man who forgave his oppressors. But Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was not born to be a symbol of forgiveness. He was born into a war, a quiet war, a daily war, a war where black children were taught to hate themselves and black men were told they had no worth. Mandela grew up in the shadows of British and Boer control. He walked the dirt roads of the Eastern Cape, knowing that his people were not poor because they lacked intelligence, but because they had been robbed. Land was taken, labor was exploited, education was twisted into obedience. Apartheid was not just a policy, it was a system designed to crush the African soul. And so, he fought. Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, and helped form its youth league, pushing the organization away from polite petitions and toward mass action. He organized boycotts, strikes, and protests, but the government did not negotiate. It arrested, it banned, it beat, it killed. In 1961, after the Sharpeville massacre, Mandela knew that peace alone would not liberate South Africa. He co-founded the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. He traveled across Africa to seek training, support, and arms. And where did he go? Not to London, not to Washington. He went to Algeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia, to revolutionary capitals, and received ideological and logistical support from the Soviet Union. Yes, Mandela was trained in Marxist guerrilla warfare. Yes, he was armed by the USSR. Yes, he sought violent resistance because non-violence was being answered with bullets and bulldozers. But the West doesn't like that version of Mandela. The CIA tracked his movements. In 1962, it was an American tip-off that led to his arrest. He was sentenced to life in prison, not for murder, not for corruption, but for daring to imagine a free South Africa. For 27 years he was locked away, first in Robben Island, then in Pollsmoor and Victor Verster. The prison walls could not contain his name. Around the world, Mandela became a symbol of defiance. But what the world forgets is this. The United States listed him as a terrorist. The UK refused to sanction apartheid. Western banks continued to invest in South Africa while black blood soaked the soil. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher called the ANC a typical terrorist organization. They embraced P.W. Botha, the apartheid president, while Mandela withered behind bars. They called him a terrorist. They funded the regime that broke his bones, and they only changed their tune when it was no longer politically convenient. In the late 1980s, apartheid began to collapse, not because the West intervened, but because ordinary South Africans refused to back down. Students, workers, mothers, soldiers, black, Indian, and colored, marched, rioted, died. The world began to watch. Corporate boycotts began to bite. Internal pressure grew. And so in 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free. But the man who emerged was not the young revolutionary who had once said, "We have no alternative but to defy the government. Violence is inevitable." He was older now, wiser, and surrounded by a world that had changed. Mandela led negotiations to dismantle apartheid. In 1994, he became the first black president of South Africa. He formed a government of national unity. He preached forgiveness, reconciliation, peace. The West applauded, Nobel Prizes were awarded, Nelson Mandela became a saint. But underneath the celebration, something was lost. Because in those negotiations, Mandela surrendered the economy. Land reform was stalled. The mines remained in white hands. The banks, the corporations, the industries remained untouched. Black South Africans won political freedom, but not economic liberation. The radical policies once discussed by the ANC, the nationalization of mines, the redistribution of land, the dismantling of white monopoly capital, were abandoned under pressure from the West and local elites. The IMF smiled. The World Bank returned. Investment flooded in, not for justice, but for profit. And so Mandela became the acceptable revolutionary. Not because he changed, but because he compromised. To the world, he was a model African. Polite, gentle, forgiving. But many South Africans, decades later, still live in townships, still walk miles for clean water, still work for crumbs in the very mines their ancestors built. Mandela did not fail. He was cornered. He chose peace over war. He chose unity over vengeance. And he knew the alternative was bloodshed on a scale too great to bear. But the truth remains. Mandela was not freed by the West. He was freed by African resistance, and he was embraced by the West only after he gave up the fight for full justice. Today, he is remembered as a hero, and he was. But not the hero the world celebrates. He was a radical, shaped by struggle, trained by socialists, jailed by racists, and later claimed by capitalists who had once tried to destroy him. He was the man who once said, "The history of Africa will one day be written by Africans using the instruments of Africa in a voice that is African." That history is still being written. And in that story, Mandela must be remembered in full, not as a saint, but as a soldier, not as a symbol, but as a man, flawed, brilliant, burdened by compromise, and crushed by the weight of a nation's dreams. They called him a terrorist when he was dangerous. They called him a hero when he was harmless. But Africa knows the truth. He was always dangerous because he dared to believe that black people deserve power. 13. Muammar Gaddafi, the revolutionary lion of Libya, loved by some, hated by others, but undeniably one of the most fiercely independent African leaders of the modern era. This story pulls back the curtain on how the West first praised, then punished, and finally destroyed a man who dared to challenge global power and dream of a united Africa. He was called a madman, a dictator, a tyrant. But before all the propaganda and gunfire, Muammar Gaddafi was a boy from the desert, barefoot in the sand, watching foreign oil companies suck Libya dry while his people slept in tents. And he swore this would not be their destiny forever. Born in 1942 in a Bedouin tent under the harsh sun of colonial Libya, Gaddafi grew up under the shadow of Italian fascism and Western imperialism. Libya, rich in oil, was treated like a pit stop for empires, a land with wealth that never reached its own people. Gaddafi came of age reading Nasser, dreaming of Arab nationalism, Pan-African unity, and a world where Africa was not begging but leading. In 1969, at just 27 years old, Gaddafi overthrew King Idris in a bloodless coup. There were no Western advisors, no multinational backers, just young officers with vision and fury. Libya's monarchy collapsed overnight, and Gaddafi stood before his people not as a new king, but as a revolutionary leader. He expelled Western military bases. He nationalized oil. He demanded that Libya's wealth serve Libyans, and for a time, it did. He used oil revenue to transform Libya into one of the richest nations in Africa. Free healthcare, free education, electricity in every home. Newlywed couples received housing. Students were paid to study abroad. He built Africa's largest irrigation project, the Great Man-Made River, turning desert into farmland. And he dreamed bigger. Gaddafi believed in a United States of Africa, with one military, one currency, one passport. He poured billions into Pan-African institutions, funded liberation movements from South Africa to Zimbabwe, and hosted summits to build an Africa that could no longer be divided by the colonial map. He said, Africa must be for Africans. And for this, the West grew uneasy. He spoke harshly against the IMF, accusing it of strangling developing nations with debt. He rejected US military dominance and called NATO an imperial army. He openly mocked Western democracy as a dictatorship of the elite and presented his Green Book as an alternative philosophy, blending Islam, socialism, and direct people's councils. Was he perfect? No, his government jailed dissidents. His regime operated with fear. He ruled with an iron grip and allowed no open political opposition. But in the eyes of many across Africa, he was not a tyrant. He was a protector, a provider, a symbol. So the West changed the script. They first tried to kill him in 1986. The US bombed Tripoli in an operation that killed his adopted daughter. The message was clear: submit or die. Gaddafi survived. Then came Lockerbie, the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. Libya was blamed. Sanctions followed. The economy was strangled. Gaddafi was branded a global pariah. But he did not fall. He adjusted, played smart. In the 2000s, he agreed to dismantle Libya's nuclear program. He paid compensation for Lockerbie. He welcomed Western oil companies back. Tony Blair shook his hand. Hillary Clinton called him a reforming leader. The West smiled. But Gaddafi had not changed. He was simply waiting. In the background, he pushed the African Union to adopt plans for a gold-backed African currency, independent of the dollar and the euro. He proposed an African central bank, an African investment bank, and an African army to defend against foreign invasions. And that was the last straw. In 2011, protests erupted in Benghazi, part of the wider Arab Spring. But Libya was not Egypt. This was not about democracy. It was about access. Gaddafi had too much oil, too much influence, too many plans that threatened Western hegemony. The CIA and French intelligence funded and armed rebels. NATO launched airstrikes, claiming humanitarian intervention. And within months, Libya was in flames. Gaddafi refused to flee. He chose to die on Libyan soil. On October 20th, 2011, he was captured by NATO-backed rebels, beaten, sodomized with a bayonet, and shot. His last words, "What did I do to you?" No trial, no justice. Only a lynching. Hillary Clinton laughed on live television. We came, we saw, he died. But what died with Gaddafi? A stable Libya, an Africa with options, a dream of self-reliance. Today, Libya is a failed state. Militias roam the streets. Slavery has returned, and the oil once controlled by the state is now auctioned by foreign companies. But the Western media called it a victory, because they don't count African corpses. They count contracts. They killed Gaddafi not because he was a dictator. There are many they still support. They killed him because he wasn't their dictator anymore. Because he built roads without World Bank loans. Because he healed the sick without pharmaceutical lobbies. Because he dared to believe Africa could rise without Europe's permission. They assassinated not just a man, but a movement. And yet he lives on, in the quiet respect of African elders, in the frustration of youth who now ask, was he really the villain? Because Gaddafi, like Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and others before him, tried to reclaim the African future, and the future answered with bullets. But now, with these giants gone, is there any hope left for Africa? The vampires haven't left. They've only changed their tactics. They come now not with guns, but with grants. Not with bombs, but with bank loans. Not with boots, but with billion-dollar smiles. And still, Africa bleeds. So we ask, when will we be free? Who will rise again? How long will we trade our dignity for aid, our soil for signatures, our dreams for silence? Tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, the diaspora? Do you feel what they felt? Drop a comment. Like, share this story with your children, with your brothers, with the world. Because if we forget them, we bury Africa's future. This is Black Stories Untold.